with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
Welcome, good evening to another edition of Globespan24x7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. Joining us tonight is Mr. Devin Bissoon, as usual, who is the technical operator. We are discussing tonight nominations and moving forward in Guyana on various forms of issues. We are joined tonight by four very distinguished panelists. Mr. Vincent Alexander of GCOM in Guyana, Mr. Ravi Dev, former ROAR leader of Guyana, probably still is leader of ROAR, largely dysfunctional over the last several years. And we have out of the United States, Professor Terence Blackman of Medgar Evers College, a professor of mathematics, and our Dr. Betram Ramarak of the Community College of Long Island. Gentlemen, SUNY Long Island. Gentlemen, welcome to this edition of Globespan24x7. Thank you very much for taking your time off from your very, very busy schedule. We are discussing nominations and moving forward. And, I was just wondering, before we can begin with the program, if Mr. Vincent Alexander could give us a little background about the nomination process that was just completed in Guyana on Monday.
Well, we have scheduled elections for June the 12th. There is a time frame by which nominations should be made for the elections. The way in which the elections are configured for local government, there are two aspects. Each local authority has a number of seats that are contested for in the local authority. Those seats are divided in half, 50-50. 50% are contested across constituencies. So for example, if it has been decided that the local authority will have 10 seats, 10 candidates, 10 councillors, then 5 of those will be elected through constituencies, so that the local authority area we divided into constituencies, and 5 of the 10 will be elected through those constituencies, in which instance individuals can participate, community groups can participate, as well as political parties. The remaining 50%, or 5 in this instance, will be contested on the PR basis. That's across the entire LLA. And political parties and community groups can contest in that aspect. Individuals obviously can't, because it's 5 seats you're contesting for, and what the electorate does in that instance is to vote for a party or a group, and based on the proportion of the votes acquired, then the seats are distributed. So what you had 2 days ago was a nomination process where the various candidates were proposed. To be proposed as a candidate, one has to have a certain number of backers, a nominator and backers to be proposed. And one has to, in the circumstance of a local government election, both the candidates and the electorates have to be associated with a specific constituency in which they wish to exercise their vote, or in which they wish to be elected. So it's constituency based, and therefore residency is an element in the case of those elections. So when they go to make the nominations, the officials have to ensure that they meet the criteria, that they have the required age, that they are registered, and that they are registered, in fact, in the relevant constituency so that they can be elected in relation to that constituency. I think basically that's
Okay,
kind of information.
so I just have two clarification, or one would be a clarification and one of a notation, which is you have to live in the district in order to run for a seat in the district?
Yes, the law specifies that you must be ordinarily resident in the division and or the constituency in which you're seeking to run for a seat. Yes, you have to be ordinary resident. That was one of the issues we had during the preparation. Because of that provision, the claims and objections had to be constituency based. Because you could have someone removed from the list for the constituency, although that person would not be removed from the register of registrants. Also could be removed from that list because he or she may not have been resident in that constituency. So
living in the NDC itself does not qualify you for the seat, to run for the seat. You must be...
living in the NDC qualifies you to run for one of the PR seats.
Okay.
All right, so that's across the board. But to run for one of the constituency seats, then you have to live in that constituency.
Gotcha. And the second point I wish to make is that there are 70 NDCs and 10 municipalities. So I wonder if you could just explain what that is about.
Well, there are two types, so to speak, of local government authorities. There are municipalities and there are neighborhood democratic councils. One could say that the municipalities are in the areas which may be considered as urban areas, so to speak, and the neighborhood democratic councils are in the rural areas. And what you find is that in each of the regions, you have what may be considered the capital of the region, the tongue in the region, and that's where you have the municipality. And in those regions, you also have neighborhood democratic councils. You would find that you have municipalities across the entire country because the regions are 10 and across the country. You don't have municipalities, you don't have neighborhood democratic councils across the country in the same manner. They are mostly on the coast, except that you have in region 9, you have one, Aranaputa. In region 1, you have three of them. And in region, that's the extent to which you have neighborhood democratic councils that are not on the coast, including Kokwani, which is in region 10.
So Kokwani is now a municipality. Was it before?
No, it's not a municipality. It's a neighborhood democratic council.
NEC, okay. Right.
Yeah.
So one can run for as a councillor for an NEC, loses, and still end up being a councillor by the process of the top-up votes. Am I right? The PR
No,
votes.
there's no interrelationship here between the constituencies and the PR. They're quite separate. But indeed, one could be listed as a candidate in a constituency and can be listed as a candidate in the PR. If you lose the constituency, then your party or community group can pull you from the PR list. But they're quite separate. When you go to vote, the voter votes for the constituency candidate, separate and apart for the vote for the party, which applies to the PR candidates.
All right, just one
It's
other
not like
question.
the national elections where there's a top-up. There's no top-up here.
Okay, so just for clarification, when you use the illustration example of 10 seats in a particular NDC or a municipality, but it doesn't have to be 10. It could be 15 or 20 or 25. That was just an illustration. So do you have any idea of how many in each one, because they're not fixed?
How many what?
How many seats are there in some NDCs? What's the lowest number and the maximum number, if you know?
I think the maximum is 30, and the lowest would be, I think, 6.
Okay, so the 30, I think, would be for Georgetown. Am I correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Would be for
6, I think, in some way, like Mocha Arcade, you may have 6.
all right. So the number varies between 6 and 30, depending on the NDC or the municipality.
It depends on the size and population, more or less.
Okay. And then out of the election, someone is chosen as chair, if I'm correct, of that particular NDC or mayor of the municipality.
The chairpersons of the NDCs and the mayors are chosen annually from among the members, from among the councillors of that particular NDC or municipality. So they're chosen annually. The
Okay,
chairperson
good.
and the vice chairperson, the mayor and the deputy mayor, they're chosen annually.
Okay, so I think that gives enough clarification of what the process looks like. So I wonder if you could just tell us, if you have the authority to do that, how was the process on Monday, the nomination day?
Well, I observed the process in part of the country. Obviously, you can't observe it because what we're having would be 80 elections. And so there are 80 centers that processed nominations. I observed the process essentially on the East Bank from the Lamaha, Yarracabra area, right down to the Eccles, Ramsburg area. And for all intents and purposes, the process went relatively smooth. There was no temptation. There was in one instance a community group which was not processed, and that's in the Good Success Caledonia area. What the returning officer said to me is that their documentation was not up to speed and they were not processed. But apart from that particular area, I think in all of the other NDCs, the submissions were processed. What's interesting to note is that that was the only area in which a community group sought to participate. In every other area, the participants are the political parties, specifically the PVPC and the APNU.
And that particular area will be processed, I guess, in due time or already processed?
It's already processed.
Okay.
It's already processed. As we speak, the parties are receiving their documentation indicating that their submissions have been approved.
Good, great. I have a few more questions for you about the process, but before I do, I was just wondering whether the other three panelists have any questions or comments to make about their process so far. Ravi Dev?
Well, Vincent, from what I understand, there will be 3 days after nomination day, meaning ending today, where there can be objections to some of the requirements of the submissions. For instance, if the list, 2 lists cannot have the same individuals, and then they have to be stricken off if there is such for the one who came later in sequence of submission. So therefore, I think by today, there might be quite a lot of amendments, and there might be some constituencies that where a group or a party or an individual who thought they would get on might not get on. Am I correct?
All right. As I said earlier, even as we speak, these groups, these parties and individuals are receiving their letters of approval. Whether the nominations are submitted, what the returning officers are supposed to do is to determine on the face of the documentation that they meet the requirement. It means that the returning officer does not at that particular point in time go to check to see that the individual is in fact registered in the constituency for which he or she seeks to contest. So when they do that, they then advise the parties. And in the instance where there's no need for advice, they're certified. Other instances, they're advised and given time to make the corrections to the submission. And as you correctly said, there is a period of time for that purpose. I think as we speak, the period of time for that purpose would be up to the 26th.
Yes, 26th.
If I may, in Trinidad, the candidates or the nominees are usually given time to fix their nominations if there is a problem. Does that process also?
That's what we're speaking about.
Yeah.
They can deal with issues of defects in the list. They can deal with issues of corrections during this period.
Okay, so within these 3 days, you're allowed to fix your defects.
Yes.
Okay, good.
They're brought to your attention and you're allowed to fix them.
Ravi?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that because I know in my district, I'm part of Ifla-Tushin, there have been individuals going around verifying that yes, they were the ones who did, make the approval of a particular candidate and such things. So I asked, what are you all doing here? And they told me, well, if you say that you did not give your approval, that your signature was forged or something like that, then that person will then have a defective submission.
Yeah, okay. Any other points or comments, Ravi, before we ask?
I think I have said that I ran the East. I have heard of some issues in Wakanam, for example, where there seemed to be some issue about people withdrawing their support. I've heard of that in Wakanam. I've also heard that has occurred somewhere in the quarantine. There are some contentions, and I'm not verifying anything at this time. I'm just saying that there are some contentions that people have been intimidated to withdraw their support for lists that they may have signed up on.
Okay. Anything else, Ravi?
No, that's about it. I think we're clear on the process, at least.
Professor Blackman, any comments, questions about the process?
Well, I know Ravi was pretty good. He said he was pretty clear. As I listened to Mr. Alexander, I thought, first off, I wanted to commend him and his colleagues for administering such a large kind of undertaking over, 80 constituencies across Guyana. And
80 local authority areas. In fact, there are 529 constituencies.
Yeah, 80 local authorities, so 70 NDCs and 10 municipalities. That's a big job. And so I just wanted to commend you on that. And the thought that I had listening to it is that I've never heard this explanation that you've been giving as part of my own high school or elementary school in Guyana. And it struck me that I was unaware of what are the sort of educational processes that citizens are engaged with that allow them to understand the full dimensions of this process. And so that was the question, one, to commend, and then to ask, what's the normal process for educating citizens about the way in which the NDC process operates.
But before Vincent says anything, I just want to bring up a pet peeve of mine. You could have done this when you were in school, Terence, because Vincent and Collie Moore, when I was in Parliament, were locked, I think, for a decade working out this thing. So I don't know exactly what they were doing, but it took forever. Vincent, over to you.
Or two things. GCOM structure provides for both on civic education department, and they have the responsibility to do vote and civic education. I must confess that I don't think that we have done a good job this time. In fact, we haven't had a vote and civic education manager for some while, and for me, that's a deficiency in our operation, particularly this election. I think in 2018 we did a better job. I think in 2016 we did a better job. The system we presently have only came into existence in 2016. Prior to 2016, we did not have constituencies. We had a straight PR system in each of the local authority areas. It is in 2016, after that 10-year process that Ravi referred to, that there was some reform of the local government system in keeping with the constitutional reform process that had preceded local government reform. And then we introduced constituencies as a part of the electoral system in an attempt to create a system where there was greater accountability between the citizens and the councillors. So this system really came into existence in actuality in 2016, and this will be the third time we have any elections under this reformed system.
I think if I heard you right, you said 596.
529 constituencies.
Okay. And half are PR and half are constituencies.
That's correct.
Okay. Professor Beto Ramray.
Well, I think Vincent, who was a longtime member of GCOM, did a pretty good job at summarizing. It does sound a little complicated. So my question was, like the good professor was, what is being done to educate people, especially given the fact that, educate them about the process, especially considering the fact that, you're going to have people voting for the first time. And when you look at the last 3 elections, I believe, Vincent can correct me on this, you have roughly about, I'd say between 25 to maybe 32% of the population did not vote. So I think that the education process is something that, should have been or has to be built into this electoral process, especially to get young people into the process. But I thought Vincent did a pretty good job at explaining how that works. My other comments, if I can be a spoiler here to kind of move ahead a little bit, from what I'm seeing, it seems like and again, Vincent, is attesting to this, that despite those little glitches, it seems like things are pretty much moving, as it should, so to speak, if I can use that term. But I would say, from looking at this from the outside, notably absent, obviously, are the 2 parties that have been very much a part of the process recently, the WPA and the AFC. So this is now a contest between, primarily the PNC, which is APNU, and the PPPC. So it's a 2-party contest. I do have to, I should say, commend APNU for having local elections in 2018 after a long spell. And we can talk about, in terms of looking forward, what do we expect? And I think we have, I'm not a pollster, we do have a pollster here, but we do have the results of 2018, which we can talk about. But the other thing I want to conclude with is, obviously we're seeing situation where, again, this is just anecdotal from a parent. It's not based on any kind of scientific, study. It seems like one party, which is the PPP, based on what we are seeing, seems to be very jubilant, very upbeat about the process. I'm not seeing that from the other side. And the other thing we do have, obviously, is we're seeing people who were once part and parcel of the process for another party is now being part of the process of another party. And the two names that keep coming up would be Patricia Chase, who was in charge of the municipality of Georgetown, and the other person who was an APNU AFC councillor. I think his name was Lennox Gasper from Linden. So we're seeing some of those things, and I would be curious as to how those things play out, and maybe in our discussion we can kind of get into more about that. But I should add also one more thing is we're seeing some concerns being raised. Despite what Vincent is telling us here about things kind of pretty much rolling along smoothly, that there are some other glitches which the opposition is claiming. So I'm wondering if those comments are geared towards a future objection to the results of the election. So I do have to say that, given our history, when it comes to the election in Guyana. So I'll leave it at that.
So before
let me respond to
okay, go ahead.
that this way. These elections should have been held since last year. And even this year, we have had at least 2 to 3 postponements. So when I talk about things being pretty okay, I'm talking about what occurred on nomination day. But we have had a number of bumps along the way to nomination day, and we have had to redo some processes because of those hurdles. And I did reference one of those processes which was redone. For example, early in the process, the minister had issued an order demarcating the constituencies, specifically the new constituencies. Now, that is not authority which is under the purview of the minister. There was a standoff for some time, and subsequently GCOM had to take the position that the minister did not have that authority, and therefore GCOM should itself undertake the exercise of demarcation of boundaries. So we had that hiccup, and that postponed things for a while. We also had a hiccup where the GCOM had proceeded to seek to sanitize the list, quote unquote, by virtue of looking at the process called advertency. If there was inadvertent inclusions or omissions, then one could have gone to have those corrected. But that process was not the appropriate process, because given the constituency nature and the LLA nature and the law providing for one being ordinarily resident, then the claims and objections had to be done based on the constituency list rather than the voters register at large. And so we had to go back and redo that exercise of claims and objections, which was being undertaken in a wrong manner. So yes, there have been issues along the way, and my reference was specifically to what happened on nomination day. Suffice to say that there is a matter in court that has not been ruled on as yet, so that we don't know what will be the outcome of that and how it may affect the elections which are scheduled for June 12th. One other point is that in terms of local government elections, I don't think that we've gotten past in any instance a 35% turnout. We haven't gotten past 35% turnout in any instance.
Okay, so I just need two other clarification, if you don't mind, Vincent. Is election every 2 years or 3 years? And I asked that because 2016 there was one, and 2018 there's another. Whereas in the rest of the CARICOM state,
our elections for local government are scheduled every 3 years. We have gone past the schedule. We've gone past the scheduled time, but it is scheduled by law. It's supposed to be held every 3 years.
Right. So it was due in 2021, and it was, I guess, postponed until now.
Yes.
And you made reference to this case. I believe I read in the papers that there is a judgment that the Chief Justice is going to render sometime in May. I wonder
That's correct.
if it's okay if you could tell me what the case is about.
If I'm not mistaken, the case that the Chief Justice is going to be pronouncing on is one related to the minister overstepping his jurisdiction and seeking to determine the demarcation of the constituencies.
Could that
My memory bears me right, that's the case that's presently before the court. I'm not sure if there's one about the manner in which the list was processed. Suffice to say that Jacob itself, for all intents and purposes, having misstepped, corrected the first issue, an outstanding issue where it is being contended that though the GCOM did go ahead to do the demarcation, and they did not follow due process in doing the demarcation, that for the purposes of demarcation, the point of reference should be the Constitution, I think Article 72, which speaks to the criteria which should be used for demarcation. And so there are claims that there's been some gerrymandering with the criteria required not being applied. Article 72 speaks to criteria for demarcation wherever there's demarcation in terms of our local government system.
could the ruling on either one or both lead to the vitiating of the elections for June 12th?
The latter one I spoke to could affect elections.
Okay. So we still have to wait till May.
Well, there's no waiting. We go ahead, and if the court comes with something, then we start. But there's no waiting really. We're proceeding.
All right. Professor Betaram raised some issues that we observed on Monday. In the past, we have had candidates or supporters of the PPP cross over to the PNC or APNU or AFC in elections. And this particular time, we have seen the reverse. We have seen APNU supporters, candidates crossing over to the PPP. I wonder if you could just comment on that a bit, and how do you see this moving forward?
That requires an opinionated comment.
It is an opinion. Yes.
Opinionated comment. I think that what has occurred is a reflection of the political landscape in Guyana to a very large extent. We very, very, very candidly say that the party has not served its people. That's very candidly said. What does that mean? I think in some instances it means that individuals have not gotten out of the process what they wanted. And I think that much of the crossing of the floor may well be a reflection of that. I haven't heard them themselves make significant comments about the politics as the basis for what they have done. In fact, they haven't really made any particular comments to the nation. Ms. Chase Green, who was the main person targeted by the press, the media in this regard, just simply said, one Guyana. And I'm paraphrasing what she said. She used 3 words, but she says, I'm doing this in the interest of one Guyana. She didn't say much more than that. But what is interesting to me from a political, analytical perspective is that, for example, if you look at Ms. Green, this is the 3rd party she is migrated to. She started her political career as a GGG. She then migrated to the PNC, where she became the mayor, and then she was stepped down from that, and now she's migrated to the PPP. I don't know what's the, what one would want to say about that tendency. Another candidate I've seen, you referred to him, the one in Linden. Again, he's someone who's kind of moved from party to party. There's another candidate who was an independent who has now moved into a party. So really, many of the persons who have moved from one party to the other are people who have been in position in the previous party and have not necessarily been rewarded personally, I would say, because you're not hearing arguments from them that are about policy and programs and things like that. And generally in Guyana, what is being said is that, well, this party did not serve its constituency. And so this is the reason why people are moving on, because the party didn't serve its constituency. But I would venture to say, without prejudicing the comment that parties may not have served their constituencies, that very often this movement is associated with individuals who may not have gotten in one party what they were looking for. And it is a trend which now follows what has happened nationally, really. This has happened nationally. And nationally in recent times, there has in fact been more movement from the PNC, APNU to the PPP than the reverse, which was the case in our early history. So you can clearly see a number of people, whether it's Lumumba, whether it's Hamilton, whether it's Kwame McCoy, a range of them who have moved in the same manner I described, from party to party to party. Lumumba was the GGG, he was PNC, became PPP. Hamilton was GGG, became PNC, became PPP. McCoy, many don't know, was involved with the GGG, then became PPP. So there's a tendency for persons, and I don't want to characterize them, but there's a trend that the persons who have done this have not necessarily moved from one party to another. They have, in fact, moved across the spectrum.
In Caribbean societies, a candidate generally move from one party to the other party because they feel they wouldn't get renomination. Is that a factor as well?
I would not say that that's a factor. I don't think so. If I could be more candid, I know, for example, that when Lumumba left the PNC, he left because he was dissatisfied that he had not been given a parliamentary seat. I don't think the question was renomination. The question was he hadn't gotten what he wanted at that point in time. I think I could say similarly that Hamilton was distraughted that he had been with the PNC for 2 to 3 elections and they had lost, and he virtually, and I can say this, virtually felt that he could not continue to ride a losing horse. So those kinds of personal reasons I have, I can say I knew caused people, at least they articulated their movement on that basis.
I have a few more questions, but rather than make it a two-way conversation between you and I, let me just bring in Ravi Dev if he has any views on this before I go back to Vincent.
To return to Beto's observation that the nominations appear to be a two-way horse race between the PPP and the PNC. I just want to add a comment and then maybe an observation. One would be that way back when Vincent and Collymore were huddling for a decade, many groups, including ROAR, we had proposed that at the local government level, political parties should not be competing, that to make local government real and local, it should be confined to groups or individuals from the local areas, so that, in a sense, take my village of Iflat, that the individuals from Iflat would understand the local needs and demands, and that the individuals they nominate and put to run would then be better qualified to deal with a local problem. And at some point, I'd like if Vincent could maybe tell us a bit as to what happened to that, because I still feel it's a problem, because all we are doing, and we saw it in the nomination day, we saw it as Beto saw it from abroad. He saw that basically we had moved, all we had done was to move the national election one level lower, and it played out in what we are all using, the same mode of analysis from national elections to local elections, when in fact it should be a whole different analysis, again in terms of local government. But here again we're talking about the national, who crossed the floor, who didn't cross the floor. What does that mean? Because by and large, if you're going to get somebody, let us say from the other side, let's be real about it, unless that person has a following, has built up a following, that person is simply crossing over and bringing himself or herself alone. I doubt if they even bring along their family. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's the point. The point is there a following? And as we saw going way back to the first Burnhamite regime during the 64, 68, when a host of PPP MPs were enticed to cross over, they didn't really bring across anything. So unfortunately, what we're doing is to do the same thing at the local level. And I really think it's not a positive sign. So the other thing I wanted to bring to notice, and maybe Vincent can comment, he's also in Guyana. What I noticed was, at least in West Coast where I am, take for example Denamstel, the PNC allowed local groups in a totally PNC stronghold. It's one of those villages, as we know, that was bought after slavery, a proprietary village, but still a totally African village. And yet the PNC did not feel a slate in certain constituencies. So that's something new, Beto, that and those of us from abroad, that we should look when we hear of all the nominations. I think there will be an increase of independents, groups and individuals from PPP constituencies. And I've been trying to grapple as to where this came from. And all I have been able to say up to now is that there's a tremendous amount of confusion in the traditional PNC constituencies because of the mixed messages, where one faction of APNU came out and said we should boycott the elections. We shouldn't even go to local government elections for any number of reasons. So I think this has done a disservice to the PNC, which is a mass party, to say do not compete. And so right now, when the decision was made, then at least in my village of Iflat, where I can go across to the African section, talk personally as to what's going on, that confusion was reflected as to whether who they support in the village. And I think it will have a very adverse impact come June 12th. So that would be my comment on the question that people posed.
Well,
I know you said you didn't want it to be, kind of a dialogue between two, but what Ravi has said I need to comment on. Firstly, in the constitution reform process, where I represented the PNC, we did put on the table the question of non-participation of political parties in the local elections, more specifically at the level of the neighborhood councils as opposed to the municipalities.
PNC did that.
We did.
Okay.
We did. And I was the person. In the reform more, I persisted in that regard. But what came out of the process was, one can call it a compromise, because the PPP were against taking political parties out of the process at the local level. They were thoroughly against it. What should also be noted, and you correctly said, that the period of height, the PNC did in fact, to a fair extent, step back from participating in the local elections and allowed community groups to do so. This changed, I would say, in 2016, when the PNC seemed to come back into participating across the board in many more places than previously. But under Haight's regime, and I must confess I was active at that time, we did not embrace participation in local elections unless there was the absence of community groups to do so. That has changed to some extent, though, as you correctly said, there's still people in the PNC who feel that really we should let community groups participate rather than have party groups participate. The other thing is that if one looks at the elections this year, I think there has been a reduction in the number of community groups and individuals who participated. There were many more even up to 2018. Now in 2022, there are less.
Kevin, are we back?
Huh? There are less participants in terms of community groups. Like I said, along the East Bank, where I worked, only one community group came forward. And I think in Georgetown, if I'm not mistaken, there was only one community group as well. So there's been a significant reduction in the number of community groups that participate. But I agree with Ravi that at local level, I do agree with him 100%, that really it should be left to community groups for a range of reasons, and that in those circumstances, the electoral system to simply be one of constituencies without this double hybrid system, to simply be one of constituencies with first past the poll in each of those constituencies. That's what I advocated for, but unfortunately, from my perspective, that's not where we're at.
And let's bring back village councils.
Yeah, I like the idea. I don't know if you guys can hear. It seems like Mr. Ram had some issues. I like the idea of the constituency, and I think, you know, that works well with me. But a couple of points I do want to make here about this whole issue of migration. I mean, you know, Guyana's history when it comes to electoral politics has always been about migration. You know, Forbes Barnum was with the PPP, he formed his own party. And you can say that for a lot of different people, right? So if we take the fact that, as Vincent is saying, you have more people migrating to the PPP, that poses a tremendous problem, you know, for having a serious opposition, right? So it's not just a migration issue, but the whole idea is that if credible people, you know, whether they can bring support or not, the PPP obviously is hoping they will bring support, but the point is you're adding to that list a more expansive base in preparation for the real election, the general election. So whatever the motive would be for people to migrate, I mean, when you look at the bigger picture here, it obviously seems to a lot of people, and I think Norton had actually hinted this, that the PPP has a lot of resources. So with that expansive base and with the migration of people, and you know, and let's be frank, the PPP, if it knows one thing well, is to be able to win elections. And Mr. Jack Day, to his credit, I believe has been in election mode since 2020. So if the party can now secure its base, I mean, you know, we say the AFC is dead meat, so therefore East and West Berbice would be solidly behind the PPP because of its traditional base. So it leaves the PPP now, you know, with a lot of resources to compete in traditionally strong PNC bases. I'm talking about Georgetown, New Amsterdam, Linden, and of course Bartica. So if we look at these local elections, and I know according to Vincent, you have like about 30% of the people who come out to vote, but it's like a testing ground and a training ground. I mean, when we look at the 2018 local elections, if I can get my numbers correct, the PPP won 61%, APNU had 34%, which was a difference of about 54,000. Okay, we know it's a local election and most people don't come out to vote, but the AFC got 4%. So, but if this is a two-way electoral race, given the resources that the PPP now command, with the migration, and of course you're looking at an economy, that is drastically being changed. Unfortunately, we will not have a credible, powerful opposition as we should have. So you're looking at a disaster for a PNC when it comes to, not just this local election, and I don't think that's based on opinion. I think we can kind of pretty much based on what we've seen before. So we know we're looking at a situation where the PNC will be devastated further. When it comes to the local election as well as the national election, whether it's in 24 or 25.
I would say that one shouldn't necessarily use at the local election as a sample of what would occur at the national election in terms of percentages. For this reason, the way Guyana is populated, we have ethnic enclaves. And I would contend that Indo-Guyanese reside.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry, I seem to be having a problem not hearing you. But I was wondering if Vincent, if he's not talking, if you could talk about what would be the impact of what happened on Monday about the crossover of candidates, former candidates from APNU to PPP.
I was talking, and in fact, in your absence, I think we were discussing that point. But what I was talking to is the fact that local government elections, from a objective and statistical perspective, do not give you an idea of what will happen in national elections. So if we have 520 something constituencies, let's take the figures there. PPP can probably win 6 or something % of those constituencies. AP and UPNC can probably win 30 or something % of those constituencies. But those constituencies do not represent absolute figures. Don't represent absolute figures because the areas that support the PPP are far more dispersed into constituencies and LAs than the areas that support the PNC. So, for example, we know in an election that the PNC gets close to 30 something or probably 40% of its votes from Georgetown. But that's only one local authority area. So when they win Georgetown, they win one, as opposed to the PPP winning Riverton, Rose Hall, and Regina. They win 3. But if you want to look at it from a population perspective, those numbers in those areas that I just referred to do not outnumber the numbers in Georgetown. So all I'm saying is, yes, from a psychological perspective, winning all of these LLA areas can impact how people see things and influence the way people behave, but objectively, from a statistical perspective, it's not a sample of what is likely to happen in a national election.
Well, if we take that as a given, then we'll look at again, to come back to the bigger picture of things. if you look at the last election where I think the difference between the combined opposition and the PPP was simply about 6,320 votes, which was about 3.55 percentage point. So my point here is that the PNC, if it was operating at a more professional level, seeing itself as an opposition in waiting, they would have stand a pretty good chance of being a serious contender.
Hi, you've reached 646420371. Please leave a message and I'll get right.
I'm going back to the events of 2015 when they established a coalition, on with the AFC, right? They did a pretty good job at winning the election, and of course the election was close. But I think a lot of things have also worked against the PNC, and again, and you might be right, it is a psychological perception, but you have a PNC now, or APNU that, in a sense, seems to, well, there is a wedge between obviously the APNU and WP and AFC, and then the other smaller parties, they are not very significant. So that advantage or that close advantage APNU may have had in terms of winning an election, with that difference of 6,000 votes. I think all of the events that happened since 2015, I don't see them pulling, votes from the rural area as much. Let's say Berbice, for instance. You have, events dealing with the recent conflict with the WPA, with Norton not being very upfront about, condemning the vitriol rhetoric. And again, you see the PNC taking a position, as if the election is being set up at this moment. So what I'm saying is all of those events are not going to help the APNU in the long run when it comes to these elections. And yes, psychologically, I do believe that whether it's 25% of the people voting in June, that's going to be a psychological effect. And coupled with that, you have all the other issues that are taking place within the PNC that's going to create roadblocks for them to become, I mean, don't get me wrong. I believe we need to have a very strong, opposition that makes the country go forward. But the reality of it, I don't think APNU, more or less the PNC, is capable of putting up a challenge. And I think 2015 was a watershed year when we saw that we could have had a viable two-party system, whether it's ethnic based or whatever. And my sense is, again, maybe Mr. Bishram can take a poll on this. My sense is it seems like a lot of young people are moving towards the PPP. And they do have the advantage, as I said before, with the oil windfall. And I think, and again, as I said, Norton has indicated that the PPP he has admitted that they have a lot of resources. And they are going to focus, as Mr. Jack Davis says, on those traditional PNC area. So therefore, and again, my question here is, and where I'm heading with this is, what would the PNC do at that point when it is going to be a scenario where they're losing election and there's a tradition of rigging election. So what is the next, when we turn the next page, where are we heading with this? Are we seeing elections as, let's say, some folks in the WP are saying doesn't matter, and we throw the electoral process out of the window?
If I might say a word, and I don't speak for the PNC, but I think this conversation has revealed why it's actually counterintuitively, I think that as an objective observer, I think that the PNC is not terribly out of the game. It just depends on what is done. I think, as Mr. Alexander's noted, these local government election, so to speak, in a way, are not a proxy for a national election in much the same way that, here in the United States, the way in which the demographics are concentrated in red states, blue states. So Democrats winning, New York, Northeast, and California, and Republicans winning in between. So what's also very important, and if I were someone who had an opportunity to give some advice to the PNC in this context, in spite of all of the challenges that you've mentioned in terms of the things that followed the no confidence motion and the elections and so on, at the end of the day, the numbers don't lie. The margin of victory was about 6,000 votes, and so in a contest, in some sense, its worst period, it lost by perhaps 1 or 2% of the electorate. So what I see is that, if the PNC could focus on sort of building a stronger and more competent leadership team, if the PNC can develop a clear, more compelling message, if the PNC can really focus on its party infrastructure and really strengthen its party infrastructure, if the PNC can, in a credible way to the electorate, continue to hold the government accountable, and there are some things I probably should say, but I wouldn't say, but I just simply say if they can continue to hold the government accountable by really, exposing wrongdoing, by proposing to be a policy force on an alternative sense, if they can continue to move the alliances with the other political parties, and if there's some clear long-term strategy that is evident, then I think the PNC, or as any political party, could become a much more effective one. And I think that the PNC ought not to be fearful in the sense of being a relic of the past, because in the last elections they lost by 6,000 votes. And so that is not in some real sense an insurmountable vote count in a very real sense. The other point I wanted to make, which has come up in our discussions, and I think these are the kinds of things that, in a way, I would like to see if I were to offer advice to the PNC, or I would say, the question of crossover votes and crossover candidates race. Well, I think the PNC and all political parties need to say, look, people have freedom of choice to choose their political association in Guyana, and we're happy to, if someone feels that our party no longer meets their needs, then we're happy to be effective, and they think that they can be an effective advocate for the other side, then we're happy to have that conversation. I don't think that, I think one of the things that I've noted in the media is the sort of sense of, the people who have changed their political stripes, whatever you perceive their reasons for, whether you perceive their reasons to be economic, whether you perceive their reasons to be, whatever you perceive their reasons to be, I think that the official policy line has to be that anyone, a Guyanese, can choose their political association, and the PNC should reflect that message unequivocally. I think it in a way hurts them to feel as if they are entitled to someone's choice, or someone can't make a choice. People will make a choice for the PNC because there's something clear and compelling about that political formation. So I wanted to say that. I also wanted to maybe switch, and I think this is where I think the PNC needs to develop a clear and compelling message. The point is, the national patrimony is precisely that. It is the national patrimony. And so
you have reached 646-2037.
The PNC speaks on behalf of, a side that is minus 6,000 represents minus 6,000 of the PPP minus 6,000. That is a significant population. And so they ought to be very strong in making demands on the national patrimony. I mean, if I were to be a critic of the PNC, and I know, I think what we have noted in the local government elections that Mr. Alexander spoke so eloquently to, is that, all races and ethnic groups, all classes are participating. And so in some sense, when the PNC spends an extraordinary amount of time trying to characterize sort of Guyana as an apartheid state, what we just saw undermines the message of it being an apartheid state. So I think the PNC is really not far away from, I would have a very, very different message for the PNC than you have, Beto, in the sense that I think that in a very absolute sense, they're 6,000 votes short. And they lost by 6,000 in somewhat really, really bad conditions. And so, if they were to really focus on the questions of leadership, really continue to think about the message, really continue to engage the electorate, and they have an opportunity to do it here, really continue to think about the party infrastructure, to sharpen the message about holding the government accountable, and to look for alliances form effective alliances with the other opposition parties, then I think, my message to the PNC is that, look, they can be a much more effective opposition, and it's not very hard. There are 5 or 6 things that they need to be focused on doing. So I wouldn't throw the baby out here with the bathwater. They've historically been a force to be reckoned with, and they represent whatever the number is for the PPP. They represent PPP minus 6,000, and that is almost 49% of the population of Guyana. So that's just a thought.
If I may step in here, because I think a lot has been said, but I'd like to put some focus into it. And I speak from the perspective of one who was in the opposition for 5 years, between 2001 to 2006, and worked closely with many of the players who are in the PNC right now, including Vincent and Aubrey and what have you. And again, I think part of the problem is that the PNC has to have a very clear picture as to what it is. The PNC was founded as a mass party. It wasn't founded as a party for African Guyanese, because the nature of our society is such that the individuals who voted cleaved along that line. That was a consequence of our historical development. In its aspiration and in its reach, both parties attempted to be multiracial parties. It has now become even more necessary to be that creature, a multiracial party, because we are now a nation of minorities. It's something that, history changes, societies changes. And I always will now say it is fortuitous for us. If you want to practice electoral politics, the PNC, like the PPP, will have to reach across the traditional divide. So the PPP can say, and will say with a straight face, these individuals who have come aboard is because we are doing the logical thing. We are doing the necessary thing. And they have said it openly from 2020 when they went into office, that we will court the African Guyanese vote. And they have done it. And what we saw on Monday, nomination day, was what they would call their success. And again, I come back to the local, that at the Namstel, as long as I could remember, because being a West Coast fella, you observe what happens in your neighboring villages. The PPP has never been able to get more than 8 to 10 votes in the Namstel in national elections. Okay. So for them to be able to put together 105 or 120 odd backers in the Namstel, for them to be able to put out all those candidates with their red shirts, to live in that village, who live in that village, a very close-knit village, I think is very significant that we can't just dismiss, because as all of us concede, and Terence just emphasized, the numbers that separate the two large parties isn't very large. So everything matters. So what I would like to feel, and this has been my frustration when we have had other individuals on this program, the PNC has to accept its national role. cannot deviate from that, cannot become bogged down by seeing itself or presenting itself as a party for only one ethnic group. One may question whether it's sincere, and it will be questioned, but that's part of how Guyana's robust politics plays out. Mr. Burnham expelled Mr. Quayana for a particular reason in 1962, and it was for this particular reason, that the PNC should not be seen as a party just taking a stand from one particular ethnic group. And it would appear that the present leadership of the PNC isn't very clear. And I would say, I'm going to use a term that I think might sound cruel, but it's true that if you play with puppies, you're going to get bitten by flies. And right now, the PNC is allowing itself, and I'll change the metaphor, for the tail to wag the dog. And much of the damage has been that of the PNC being shot in the foot was being shot in the foot by some of its allies. It didn't need what happened. You want to alienate individuals from the Indian community who went into the PNC without being bought. You couldn't say Ganesh Mahipal was bought. You couldn't say any one of those individuals who had to now protest as to how they were represented. None of them were bought, but now they have to become defensive. And I can assure you, each one of them are considering, because what was being told to them, that you were a token, in a sense, was now shown to be so. And they have to be questioning. They have to be questioning their presence there. So in a sense, the PNC now have to start over. Why? It wasn't something the PNC did. You know, I know Aubrey from way back when Mr. Hoyt threw him out. Mr. Hoyt and I talked a lot about, you know, in fact, I asked Mr. Hoyt once, you know, what happened with Aubrey. And believe it or not, and I will say this publicly, policy, for the first time, Mr. Hoyt said, well, you know, he was passing one day in his vehicle and he sees Aubrey drinking beer at some street corner with his shirt out of his pants. True story. It shows you how Mr. Hoyt and that generation saw leadership of the PNC. But I think it probably went beyond that. As you know, Aubrey challenged Mr. Hoyt within the party. So did Vincent, I think, at that time too. But to come back to it right now, and I want to summarize what I'm saying here very clearly. We need for democracy to function in Guyana properly, we need a two-party system. We have that opportunity. It was shown in 2011 and 2015. It was shown again in 2020 that we can have the politics of in and out. But to do so, neither of the two major parties can brand itself as an ethnic party. We have to begin that process. We may say window dressing, we may call it one of that, but you begin in a sense maybe by playing with it, but it becomes a reality very soon. So I think I would close up with this thing that right now, the PNC has to come up with a strategy for winning that 50% plus one to get back into governance. But the way it is being forced by the tail as to that wagon, it has to decide as to where it can end up.
Professor, I mean, to add.
So the one thing I wanted to say, if you'd allow me, is I think I agree with Rafi on this aspect. I mean, I've always had thought that Guyana should have a slightly right of center party and a slightly left of center party, and ideological right of center and left of center. And I think in a very natural way, the PPP kind of, because of its business orientation, is something that is akin to a right of center party, and the PNC, because of its sort of social bona fides, is akin to a left of center party. I think, you know, I agree with Ravi in the sense that, you know, even as we know that these parties are representatives of ethnic communities, I think the parties themselves cannot present themselves in that way if Guyana is to move forward. There has to be a discussion like the one that we talked about, you know, the dimensions of ethnic contestation in this context. But I think that our official political parties cannot, at this moment in our history, the PPP cannot present itself as an Indo-Guyanese party, and the PNC cannot present itself as an Afro-Guyanese party, insofar as they are contesting elections for the presidency of Guyana and the seats in the parliament of Guyana, because Guyana is not simply split between Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese. There are indigenous Guyanese. There are other Guyanese that are not a part of these two ethnic groups, and so the parties have to reach beyond to represent those. And I in this sense, I do agree with Larry. And I think you can have, and this is where I think the question sort of often, you can have the conversation about how we deal with questions of ethnic contestation, and everyone always thinks that you have to have it's either A or B, and it can't be A and B. So I think we have to think about ways to have the conversation about race, because you can't address the questions of disparities. You can't address racial disparities if you don't talk about race. It makes no sense. But at the same time, two political parties cannot simply ground themselves in race, particularly at this moment when there are lots of challenges around economics, around health, around education. I mean, we started off the question about just simply voter education, about what we're doing in the local government elections and the paucity of voter education in that context. So I think that's my argument. You have to do questions around race and ethnic contestation, and you have to do a certain kind of right of center, left of center politics at the national level. And I'll say one last point. I don't necessarily believe that somehow, if you don't have political parties at the local level, that this necessarily makes it better. I can see a scenario in which, having political parties engaged in the local elections can be something that is beneficial for the nation as a whole. So I'll just withhold judgment. I don't think that that's necessary, that it's immediately true that just the absence of political parties and the presence of local groups in the local elections necessarily means somehow that the nation moves closer to solving its problems. So, but that's a separate discussion. And I'll pause there.
I would like to come back on the last point just made by Terence. The question of local elections and the non-participation of political parties. I'm of the firm conviction that at the local level, the division, ethnic division, is fueled by the participation of the parties.
Okay.
And that if the parties did not participate, you would find that you will have emerging in the local areas leadership that is far more progressive, far more non-partisan, and far more developmental, in a way that can change the national politics. The extent to which the two parties are combating, the extent to which people who are really patriots are suppressed because it is pitched as a contest between these two parties. If you don't support your party, so to speak, then something is wrong with you. But if that contest is absent, then people will be able to rise from the perspective of what is it they bring to the table in terms of their activism as community workers, as community leaders. And I think that can play a great role in reducing even the way in which political parties eventually have to play their politics, because of the manifestation of how things could work for us if we allow the best leadership to surface.
Point taken.
Okay, look, we got less than 10 minutes left. So, John, if you could just go around the circle again, first with Professor Bader and Ramarat. And if you could also talk about what does it portend for the future, for the next general election, this current local government election?
Well, I think we do share a lot of consensus here about, one, the fact is we do need a strong opposition, to kind of oversee what the government is doing, and that will benefit all Guyanese. But secondly, I think we are all making a lot of recommendation here, the three of us, in terms of, what the PNC should have done or should do to become such a credible, professional, competent opposition, so to speak. And yes, there are possibilities there, but my argument is that, since 2015, I think much of the capital that the PNC slash APNU, had established after that election has been dwindled. It has actually spent those capital, and it's going to be tremendously difficult for that organization to be able to get to that stage that we are seeing it should be as a professional opposition, credible opposition political party, because there are so many things that's going to be in its path, right? And I don't see that happening in the near future. The other point to consider is, well, I hope Vincent can take these ideas back to the PNC suggestion. The other point to remember is that, we keep talking about the 6,000 or the 1 seat difference. Obviously, the PNC can still become a very credible force because of that, number that separate both sides. But we also have to remember, when you look at the election, and again, Vincent can correct me if I'm wrong about this, as I said before, I think the 2011, 2015, and 2020 election, when you look at the numbers of the people who actually voted, there's an absence of about, I'd say, between 25 to 30% of the people who did not come out to vote. So that part of the electorate is missing. So my point is, in the presence of two credible political party, in the United States, you have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Competing is very difficult here, as in Guyana, to have a third political party because of, what the role that these third political forces have played. The UF, in a sense, allowed itself to be bought over, and then the AFC. Well, we don't need to get into that, but we know what the AFC has done. So my point is, it's not too late, to try to fix those issues for the PNC. But I think in the short run, it is going to be problematic. But even though there are 6,000 votes, when you look at the last election, that separates the two, if you consider the fact that a large chunk of the electorate did not cast their ballot, it opens up a wider, field of opportunities for both political parties, to make this a credible two-party race, where there's a possibility of, both sides winning. In 2015, when the coalition was formed, President Granger said two things, that was on his mind. We are going to make this, an inclusionary democracy, and we'll try to abolish a system of winner takes all. Now, you can argue that, 2018, the vote of no confidence interfered with that. But there was a tradition here from 2015, and even before that, 2011, when the opposition, in a sense, controlled the parliament. You look at what they have done, but more so, especially after 2015, in office and out of office, I think there's a tremendous set of hurdles that the PNC in its own making have created for themselves. And that in itself is problematic for a functioning democracy.
Okay, let's have some concluding words from Professor Blackman, Ravi Dev, and then Vincent.
Okay, so again, I will pick up where Beto left off. If I'm offering advice to the PNC on, becoming a more credible the point is, it needs to present itself as a viable alternative to the ruling party. And in order to present itself as a viable alternative to the ruling party, it needs to have, and I say this again, it has to have a clear and coherent policy platform. So it has to say something about, it has to be clear about what is its plan for the youth, What is its plan for agriculture? What is its plan for health? What is its plan for education? What is its plan for what are its priorities as it relates to the use of the oil and gas windfall? You know, and this is something that is also important. It has to speak to questions of competent leadership and competent leadership, not just meaning the head of the party. It means just the people who are there to articulate the party's vision. It means the people who are there to manage the party's affairs. It means the people who are there to provide effective opposition to the ruling party. So, you know, you mentioned the thing about Denamstel, and it had me thinking about grassroots support. So it needs to shore up its grassroots support, right? So it's you know, if you move from 8 to 100 in some place where it's one of your strongholds, then that reflects that perhaps you're not holding on to your grassroots support as well as it should be. And so that needs to be something that the folks would think about. The other thing I would say, often from an American perspective of politics, you have to have some independent media, right? So the party has to cultivate its own independent sort of media outlets and think about how it gets its message there. It has to think about money, its fundraising strategy. You can't do politics if you don't have money. And so it has to think about its fundraising strategy. And again, I think this willingness to collaborate with other individuals and for me, and I think this is a place where we got into trouble, but I will say it here again. I think the PNC has to clearly demonstrate its commitment to the democratic process. Right? I think you can't at this moment in 2023. There's no other. I mean, you might think, China is relatively authoritarian, and Russia and Venezuela might be a bit authoritarian, but I think for Guyana, we've passed this point. And I think everyone sort of in Guyana wants to see a situation where people vote and those votes determine who constitutes the government. And so I think the PNC has to really do what is necessary to communicate to the broad Guyanese electorate that it is committed to the democratic process. And I think that if it does those things, I can guarantee, Beto, that margin will shrink to less than 6,000. And so I wouldn't be pessimistic at all if I were someone who was a part of the PNC. And I think, as everyone has reflected, that having a balanced kind of political game in Guyana is better for all Guyanese. And I would certainly hope to see that as we move forward. And I would, as I would again echo Mr. Alexander's thoughts that, this local government election, whatever the ultimate figures are, in a sense, does not entrap the national debate around elections. And so, I would close there.
Ravi Dev and then Vincent.
You want me to go now?
Yeah, Ravi.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just going to echo a lot of what has been said before, but again, to put it from my perspective, which is that in IR, there is something called a Thucydides trap, which is that you have two big powers opposing each other. But the problem mightn't come from the two of them and their policies. It's when they may allow one of their smaller allies who have their own access to grind that can get them into problems and get them into a kind of politics that neither of them want. And I think right now, the PNC is suffering from that. It's allowing, again, I come back to this, it's allowing the tail to wag the dog. It has to decide whether it needs that particular tail. There are dogs without tails, and they do well. But to come back to political terms, the PNC has to decide that when it seeks coalitions, and all parties in Guyana will have to seek coalitions now. They may seek a coalition like the PPP is doing by bringing groups. And I want to contest what Terence is saying here. If you say 1 Dirty Bill Dam, and if you take what's going on in Denamsel, if you take what's going on in Dikendron, if you take what's going on in Vege, Vorganugem, and you know, he's a Tongboy, Vincent would know where I'm talking about. These are all African villages. And if the PPP is to carve out um, X amount of support, it builds up, it accretes. And what we have seen, once you have crossed that threshold, it's hard to come back because you would have been ostracized in your own village. And again, the margin is small, but don't discard it. I think the PPP has learned to play that politics, and even though it might be getting a lot of blowback within its traditional constituency, it's plodding ahead very clearly. It's a multiracial party, and it's being serious, and it has kept its word. We may talk about buying out and all of that, but they're doing what they say they will do, while the PPP is getting distracted by all kinds of extremism and having to put out fires that should never have been lit to begin with. So I want to say that it has to avoid what I see from a certain one of its allies, a descent into nihilism. Terence talks about let's have a democratic politics, rule-based politics. We can't do otherwise in this modern era. It's not going to happen. I mean, the real politics of the Western Hemisphere not going to allow when you can want to tell people we don't want anything to do with we call it electoral politics. We're going to come out in the streets and we're going to block up the place. The Americans just passed, as I said on a program here, the Global Fragility Act that gives them the authority as to what they will intervene. So in a sense, you are now poking the Americans to intervene. The 2020 intervention, if there was one, wasn't liked, and yet you want them to come back to intervene. So I don't understand this. So in a nutshell, I will conclude by saying this. The PNC has to take a deep breath, and as Terence said, let it decide on what it does. I have suggested from its own constituency, its core constituency, the Nordic model of a welfare state, where you have good educational solid there, when you have good medical care, when you have in all the aspects that the PNC has traditionally tried to take care of. You have an example from the West. They're the happiest countries in the world. Every time they measure it, let us adopt that. You get me? You're not going outside of the box, but have a coherent policy. And this might be the last thing I'll say. This is what I resent about these minor affiliates of the PNC, to say that the PNC cannot get votes from the Indian constituency. You want to tell me that right now, when everybody is talking about the cost of living, right? You can't go into a supermarket with less than $60,000, which is a month's salary. But you can't go into a supermarket and buy a basket of goods without that. You want to tell me that people, if you can come up with a program to address that, you want to tell me you ain't going to get listeners, but you ain't going to get listeners from across the divide if you have the kind of language that some of the PNC's affiliates are spouting right now. I conclude.
Mr. Alexander, your final word.
Vincent?
Oh.
He called you Mister. You didn't realize.
No, I didn't hear clearly. I didn't hear clearly. First of all, I'm still cautious about an analysis of our elections that relies on the figures that are presented in our voters list. So, for example, when one speaks about a 70% turnout on the voters list which we have, one may well be speaking of a turnout that's closer to 90%, pointing to some abnormality. I am convinced about that.
Okay.
So that what I'm saying is that our analysis in terms of numbers, I don't think the basis is the best of bases. In my humble opinion, and this is nothing new, I feel that there's a need for what I call ethnic politics. And so, for example, if Indo-Guyanese joins the PNC, he should join the PNC to go in there to speak on behalf of Indo-Guyanese. And so in the party, there should be a forum, or the party itself should be a forum, where the various representatives of ethnic groups bring to the table the issues confronting the ethnic group which they represent. But at the same time, recognize that there are problems which are not ethnic problems, they are Guyanese problems. And so the party's program should be configured around how do we address the issues of ethnic groups, the various ethnic groups, and at the same time, how do we address the issues which are commonalities for Guyanese. So in that way, a party that may have a majority of one ethnic group does not necessarily project itself into the public as a party of one ethnic group. I think it is critical that that is understood and that is practiced by those who are in the party. So that, for example, if there's an issue, Indo-Guyanese must be able to articulate the party's position in relation to Indo, Afro, and all Guyanese, rather than a position in relation to just the group he represents. Because in the internal forum, there should be a consensus as to how the party wishes to deal with those matters. And therefore, though I may be representing one constituency, I can articulate the party's policy as a national policy, seeing the interests of constituencies and the national interests in a kind of kaleidoscope rather than separate. And that's my position, and I think that is what has to be worked towards. And I think that even as we try to reconfigure national politics, that is what should emerge from that reconfiguration as well.
I'm afraid that will be the last word, because we are about 10 minutes after time. We didn't get to talk about powers of the local government, and perhaps that could be a future program among the four of you as well. Gentlemen, I really want to thank you again for your taking time from your very, very busy schedule in addressing this topic here tonight, which I'm sure would be found quite interesting among our viewers, listeners, and audience. Again, thank you very much. And on behalf of Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with Mr. Devin Bissoon as our technical operator. Again, good night.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good night.
Thank you very much.